Topic 3.6. We're going to be graphing these functions using transformations. First of all, we have to identify the parameters. The parameters for this, my a parameter is always the number that's multiplying on the outside. So the a parameter here would be -1. The b parameter is whatever number is multiplying by the x, or the coefficient of the x. In this case, that's 1. The c parameter is anything that's adding or subtracting to the x. So our c parameter here is -4. And our d parameter is anything that's adding on the outside. Here, that'll be a -3. So step 1 is to strip all my parameters off and get this to the basic function. So we have f of x equals 1 over x. And we're going to graph this. This is graphed by first using asymptotes, which are x equals 0 and y equals 0. And then we draw in the actual function here. Step 2 is to start putting the parameters back on one by one. The first parameter that I'm going to put back on is the c parameter. This is always the first parameter to put back on. It's the c parameter. So this will be 1 over x minus 4. If the c parameter is a -4, this means that the entire graph shifts to the right 4 times. So I'm going to shift my asymptote x equals 0 to the right 4 times. So it becomes x equals 4. Then I'm going to shift my horizontal asymptote y equals 0 to the right 4 times, and it remains y equals 0. Then my graph remains here to the right and down here to the left. Okay. My next parameter that I'm going to add, I see that b is 1, but that's understood, so putting a 1 here will not change anything. So I move to my next parameter, which is a is -1, which is the outside. Value here, see -1, and you have x minus 4. Now, the a parameter being negative gives you a reflection about the x-axis. Gives us a reflection about the x-axis. So, with that reflection, I start with my asymptotes. This asymptote, if reflected about the x-axis, remains x equals 4. And if you rotate y equals 0 about the x-axis, it will remain y equals 0. If you rotate this piece right here around the x-axis, it will end up down here. And if you rotate this piece along the x-axis, it will show up on top. The last parameter that we're going to add is the d parameter, right here. This will be 4th. Again, this is 2nd, and this is 3rd. So, adding the d parameter, we get -1 over x minus 4 minus 3. Now, what happens here is that the graph, because of the -3, will go down 3 times. So let's start off with the vertical asymptote. If you move the vertical asymptote x equals 4 down 3 times, it remains x equals 4. If you lower the horizontal asymptote y equals 0 down 3 times, it becomes y equals -3. The graph remains here below, and it remains here above. This is the final graph for f equals -1 over x minus 4 minus 3. And we can now get the domain and range from this final graph. So, the domain, looking at this to the left and to the right, how far does this piece go to the left? How far does this piece right here go to the right? Means that the domain is -infinity to 4. And then we look at this piece to the left and right. This piece goes as far to the left as 4 and as far to the right as +infinity. The range. we'll go back to, let's say, this piece right here. How low does this piece go and how high does this piece go? And that'll give us our range. So how low and how high. That piece goes as low as negative infinity and as high as negative 3. This next piece right here goes as low as negative 3, but goes as high as positive infinity, and that's our range. Next, our parameters. The A parameter is whatever's on the outside, so the A parameter here is 1. The B parameter is whatever coefficient is on the x. This time it's negative 1. The C parameter is whatever is adding on the inside, which is a positive 4. And the D parameter is whatever's on the outside of the entire function. Here will be 3. So step 1, we're going to strip all the parameters off to get our basic function. So we have f of x equals x squared. The basic function x squared will be a parabola. The first parameter I'm going to put back on will be the c parameter. This will be first. So the c parameter is a positive 4, so I'm going to put a positive 4 with this x. This x that came from the basic function is a positive x. So I'm going to put a positive 4 next to a positive x. Now, the b parameter being positive, sorry, the c parameter being positive, means that we're going to move this to the right 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now, this is our graph. Okay. Next, we're going to put on our b parameter. The b parameter is that negative 1 that belongs next to the x, or the coefficient of the x. So what we'll have is 4 and a negative x all squared. Now, when the b parameter is negative, we get a reflection about the y-axis. We get a reflection about the y-axis. So this flips to that side. So we get 1, 2, 3, 4, and now this is where our parabola lands, because we now have a reflection about the y-axis. It goes from this side to that side. Okay, finally we're going to add our, we're going to skip the a parameter because it's 1, that's an understood 1. And we're going to go to our d parameter, which is 3. So this is f of x equals 4 minus x all squared plus 3. And the d parameter, since it's positive, it's going to raise the graph 3 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And so this is our graph. Now, the domain and range for this final function, we can find by asking ourselves how far to the left does the graph go, left and right for the domain, and then how far up and down does it go for the range, or down and up, should I say. So for the domain, to the left and to the right, that's negative infinity to positive infinity. For the range, down and up, it is as low as 3 and as high as positive infinity. So this is, so you can put anything in here for input, but for the output you can only get answers from 3 and above. Alright, so number 5. Number 5, our parameters are a, which is 1, which is any number on the outside. The b parameter is any number that's on the x. That's a negative 1. The c parameter is anything that's adding on the inside, and that's a positive 4. The d parameter is anything that's adding on the outside. This time that's a positive 3. Step 1 is to strip all the parameters off to get our basic function. So stripping off all the parameters, we're left with the square root of x. The graph of the square root of x looks like this. And then we'll start putting the parameters on. We start with the c parameter, the b parameter, the a parameter, and then finally the d parameter. So let's put the C parameter back on first, which is a positive 4. This is a positive x. So when you put a positive 4 next to a positive x, you will get positive 4 with a positive x. And the positive 4 will move the graph 4 times to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's the graph. The next parameter will be the b parameter. We'll put that on, which is a negative coefficient on the x. So now we'll get 4 and a negative x. Okay. So negative b parameters give us reflections about the y-axis. So we'll have a reflection here. So we'll go out 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and instead of going this way, it'll come back the other way. And there's your reflection. Just like a mirror, it flips everything over. Okay. Finally, we're going to put our d parameter on. So we have f of x equals the square root of 4 minus x plus 3. Okay. Now with plus 3, it raises everything 3 times. The d parameter, if it's positive, everything goes up 3 times. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 out, but 1, 2, 3, 4 up. And this is our final graph. Now, the domain and range we can find from using this graph by looking how far to the left and right does it go. So that's domain. How far to the left does this graph go? Negative infinity. How far to the right does this graph go? 4 bracket. For the range, how low does this graph go? Well, it only goes as low as 3. And how high does it go? It keeps going up and up and up. So it's positive infinity. Okay. Now we'll be graphing f of x equals 1 over 4 minus x plus 3. First, I will identify my parameters. The a parameter is any numbers multiplying on the outside, here, which is an understood 1. B is any number that is a coefficient of the x, which is negative 1. C is anything that's adding on the inside with the x, and that's a positive 4. The d parameter is anything adding on the outside. This is a 3. So step 1, remove all parameters, and we get 1 over x. The graph of 1 over x has a vertical asymptote of x equals 0, a horizontal asymptote of y equals 0, and the graphs are in the first and third quadrants. Then let's put our parameters back on. First, let's put the positive 4 back on. This is a positive x, so putting a positive 4 next to a positive x gives us 1 over 4 plus x. The positive 4 parameter of c shifts everything to the left 4 times. So let's start off with an asymptote. When you shift x equals 0 to the left 4 times, we get an asymptote of x equals negative 4. When we shift y equals 0, that horizontal line left 4 times, it remains y equals 0. And this part of the graph remains above, and this part of the graph remains below. Next parameter we want to add is the b parameter, which is the negative 1 on the x. This will give us 1 over 4 minus x. As a result of the b parameter being negative, we're going to have a reflection, or maybe like a rotation, about the y-axis. So the asymptote x equals negative 4 will go from this side to the other side, which would become x equals positive 4. When you reflect y equals 0 asymptote about the y-axis, it remains y equals 0. When we reflect the graph itself across, it will flip over and travel upward to the right. And this part of the graph, when you flip it over, it will now be over here on the right side. the last parameter that we'll add is the d parameter, which is 3. When we add the d parameter, this will shift the entire graph upward 3. So, when we shift everything upward 3, the vertical asymptote x equals -4 will remain x equals positive 4. And the horizontal asymptote y equals 0 will rise to y equals 3. The graphs will remain in this area right here and in this area there. Now, the domain and range of this final graph. Okay, the domain is how far to the left and right is this graph going. That's as far left as -infinity and as far right as 4. Then, union with this to the left and right will be as left as 4 and as far right as positive infinity. The range asks first, how low does this graph go and how high does this graph go? That's as low as -infinity, as high as 3. Union with this one right here, which goes as low as 3 and as high as positive infinity. So this is your domain and range for this function. Number 7, the parameters. The parameter a, on the outside, we have understood 1. The b parameter stands for the coefficient on the x, which is -1. The c parameter is anything that's on the inside here that's adding, that's a positive 4. And the d parameter is anything on the outside of the function, which is a -3. After identifying the parameters, we want to strip all the parameters from the function, and that will leave the absolute value of x. We're going to graph that. The graph of this looks like a V, or has a V shape. Then I'm going to start putting my parameters back on one by one, starting with the c parameter, which is a positive 4. So I put the positive 4 together with the positive x, and this will shift my graph 4 times to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Next, my b parameter, which is the -1 for the x. So we put a -1 on the x as a coefficient, and we get 4, a -x, and this gives us now a reflection about the y-axis. Negative b parameters gives us reflections about the y-axis. Okay, so we're going to switch sides, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and now my V shape is over here. We'll say quadrant 1. Lastly, the d parameter, and again we're skipping the a parameter because it's 1, it's understood, doesn't make any changes. The d parameter is -3. So we get absolute value of x minus 4 and then -3. What happens now with the negative d parameter, it lowers 3 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, but then down 3. And so now the vertex is here, and the absolute value function looks like that. Now, the domain and range for that. The domain is how far does this graph go to the left and to the right? Well, that's -infinity to positive infinity, which means that we can put any value in here for x and it won't hurt it. But what about the range, or the answers or solutions that you can have? This graph only goes as low as -3 and goes as high as positive infinity. So this means that you can get any answer out of this as long as it's -3 and above.